So, Lee, where we'd like to start is just to invite you to kind of share with us your spiritual journey. Kind of where'd you come from? How have you, would have been some important points of growth for you over the years? Maybe talk a little bit about your spiritual growing edge these days, just to kind of give us some personal insight into you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, just kind of some of the biographical details point to some of that. I grew up in Alabama, a very conservative Church of Christ world that was a very loving family, loving church. And it was riddled with all of the strengths and weaknesses that go with a conservative sort of community. Conservative in just about every sense in the American context, and conservative in every sense in the Christian context, and Church of Christ Christian context as well. And then I took all of that very, very seriously, both the good and the bad, and was taught to take my Christian discipleship and faith very seriously, for which I remain very grateful to this day. And of course, we learned the Bible, took the Bible very seriously and tried to learn the Bible. Went to Lipscomb as an undergrad. I decided I wanted to study engineering or something of that sort. I was playing around with wanting to be either a physicist or an astronaut or an engineer. I started in engineering. I switched over to computer science, and I graduated with an undergrad in computer science. But along the way, I minored in math because of computer science, but also minored in Greek and biblical studies as well. And I had being raised in the context I was raised in, very rationalistic bent. But I had an experience when I was young. I probably was about 12, and I had developed a kind of keen sense of wanting to do the will of God, and whatever that meant, and whatever a 12-year-old can understand about that. Or I may have been younger, because this was before I was baptized, best I recollect, and I was baptized when I was 12. And I remember just having this sharp sense of some sort of calling of some sort, which was odd, again, for our context. And so all I remember, I was in our family's recreation room, playroom, and by myself. And I remember going over and getting a small slip of paper and scribbled down, "I will obey." And I just folded it up and put it away. I wish I had that piece of paper. I have no idea where it is, but I would love to find that piece of paper. I folded it up and put it away. And so I had kind of all along this kind of sense of calling. And I didn't know what it meant or what it entailed. But between my junior and senior year in college, I started ruminating more on that. And I spent that summer trying to talk to people that I trusted about trying to lean into whatever that might mean, or whatever that might entail, preaching or something of that sort, church ministry of some sort. And so by the time I got into that summer, I decided that I would finish my computer science degree, but then I would go on and go get an MA or an MDiv or something like that out of undergrad, and then just go see what happened out of that. And so the summer after I graduated, I and three of my buddies were going to go do a backpacking trip in Europe. And so I had already visited Harding Graduate School, but on my way to my flight to London, I went to Dallas to catch my flight out of the country. And I thought, well, my buddy Jeff Mankin, who was graduated with me at Lipscomb, his father was Jim Mankin at Abilene. And Jeff had said, "You need to go look at ACU." So I rented a car in Dallas and drove through one of the most horrific thunderstorms I've ever been in my life. It was just horrid on the I-20 going out there. And I got to the Mankin's house, and it was just pouring down sheets of rain. And I went into the Mankins, and they kept me for a night. And the next day I went and toured the campus and did my visits. And while I was in Europe, I decided that's where I wanted to go. And it was a terribly important decision because I learned so much at Abilene that it was incredibly formative for me, and very much determined the direction of my ministry and my teaching and my academic work, and the direction, kind of key theological the key theological formation pieces that would inform me. I'll back up and say that, at what happened at Lipscomb was that a lot of the confidence I had in all the answers to the questions I thought I had as a teenager began to break down. And I had two very informative, influential mentors as an undergrad that helped me began to put a lot of cracks in what I thought I knew and opened me up a great deal. And then Abilene helped with that a great deal as well. But of course, there's a part of that process in which one grows as a young person angry at what has been in the past. You see the failings of the past and get angry about it. Or at least that seems to be common. And that was certainly true for me. But by the end of my MDiv, I was able to, I started learning from people like Doug Foster and Leonard Allen. I started learning a lot of things about the kind of Anabaptist type heritage that we had in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And I was just fascinated by that. And that gave me, and then Leonard introduced me to people like Stanley Hauerwas and John Yoder and Jim McClendon and folks like that. And that gave the spark I needed to think I could do this for a vocation of study, this sort of stuff, and I think I could be of service to the church this way. And that's one thing I'll say is that I've always tried to construe my academic work as in service to the church rather in service to the academy in and of it, as a first calling. And I decided somewhere along there that I wasn't very good at doing the highfalutin, rarefied academic stuff, monograph kind of stuff. That stuff is really important, and we need people who will do it. But I wasn't good at it, or I didn't like doing it, that kind of stuff. And instead, I wanted to do kind of academics that thoughtful people in the pews could read and find something useful out of it, and then teach undergrads as well as seminary students. After Abilene, my wife and I went to Nairobi, Kenya for 6 months, and that was a life-changing experience for us in so many ways. I can talk more about that if y'all would like, but that was incredibly transformative for us. And then that fall, I got into Notre Dame, and I went and studied at Notre Dame. I was one of John Yoder's last graduate students. I was actually his very last student to get a dissertation proposal approved under him. That happened in September of 97. He died in December of 97. And then I finished up. Notre Dame was very good to me about helping me finish up relatively quickly. Finished up there in 99, came to Lipscomb. I've been at Lipscomb ever since 99, doing the kind of stuff I do. One of the things I think that was key in all that was I realized at some point that I was deeply schooled in shame, and I discovered this before Brene Brown started publishing her stuff. If she had published her stuff 5 or 10 years earlier, that timing sure would have been helpful to me, but she wasn't on my timeline. But so starting in my 30s and 40s, I had to work through a lot of stuff with that, and so kind of various forms of work that I did through those years that probably saved my life, and certainly kept me from falling off the deep end, and very grateful for a lot of that. I'm happy to talk more about that if that can be of help to anybody. And so practice, having rhythms of life, having very close, intimate relationships with people that they know all of my shit and I know all of theirs, and we talk openly with each other and regularly, and all that kind of stuff has been terribly important to me. And then having various forms of practices and disciplines. These days, meditation is huge for me. And I do that every day because I find I can't keep myself very sane if I don't do that. And then probably about 6 years ago, I hit a major midlife crisis and a major depression that lasted about 2.5 years, and it about undid me. And that pushed me again towards another level of vulnerability and honesty. And I never could have said in the middle of that, I'm grateful for this stuff, but these days I can at least look at it. I never want to have to go through anything like that again, but these days I can say that I'm grateful for all the things I learned out of it. And I like the person I am now more than I ever did before all of that stuff. And so I learned a lot through that process. And again, I'm happy if it helps anybody to talk about any of that kind of stuff in more detail. But that's kind of some big sweep, I would say, of some of the major pieces of my life development, spiritual development.
So drill a little deeper into your Nairobi experience. What was that all about?
Yeah, so there was a faculty member at ACU who's in the College of Business, and he had been going back and forth to Nairobi, and he said, Lee, I want you and Laura to go to Nairobi. And he was working with some missionaries there that it was the Hackett's, Charles Berkeley Hackett, and Charles and Darlene Colston at KCITI, Kenya Christian Industrial Training Institute, there in Eastleigh in Nairobi. Mm-hmm. And so we went and we lived with the Colstons. I taught and wrote curriculum at the school. Laura has an MBA. She had just finished up an MBA, so she went and worked in the business office and developed their business procedures. And along the way, I got started working some with street kids. And then that in turn helped sow some of the seeds for what became Made in the Streets, which is still an active ministry there in Nairobi. And so it was just a wonderful, for a white boy from Alabama, conservative in most every way, it was just again, a transformative, wonderful experience for me.
You are the founder of the Token Show. So I don't know how many of the folks on here have any idea what that is. So first, I'd like you to describe what it is. And then also, where did that come from? Where does that fit into your total life? Like, what is that all about?
Yeah. Well, the Token Show is a Nashville-based variety show, or as I like to tease, it's the world's only long-running theological variety show, which of course sounds horrific, but it's actually quite fun and quite lovely. We've been blessed to have a lot of wonderful people participate with us in this. You can find it at tokensshow.com. And so it's typically a live event, typically has a house band, and we've been very fortunate to have, I like to brag on this. I mean, we do literally have one of the best house bands in Nashville, which means it's one of the best house bands in the world, Mm-hmm. And we have then guest performances, and the performers range from, Country Music Hall of Famer types to unheard of singer-songwriters. Typically an Americana-esque sort of world. We do some stuff from the contemporary Christian world, but not a whole lot. Mostly Americana. And then we do author interviews and comedic sketches, and I do the kind of pointy-headed academic thing of kind of weaving it all together with some sort of loosely woven commentary to kind of hold it all together. And so each episode is around a topic, and also all the songs, the sketches, the interviews, and so forth weave around some given topic that we do in each given show. And it's been great fun. I never imagined it would get the sort of reception it's gotten. We're in our 13th year now, I think, which COVID has messed with us, but our 13th year, and it's been a lot of fun.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I would love for everybody to go to, if you wouldn't mind, to do me this favor, go to tokenshow.com/podcast and subscribe to our podcast and leave us some reviews and that sort of stuff. But we just launched this podcast 2 weeks ago, and it's been really, really fun, and we've got some really great material on there already. And the one actually that we've got released tomorrow, I was just listening back to it to kind of give the final sign off on it, and the material that we have in there, I found myself tearing up again because it's just so, and it's so appropriate for all the crap that's going on right now in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hope that you'll find it a helpful resource, and if you do, share it with other people.
Fantastic.
I love the interviews on the poets that you had on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
And by the way,
oh yeah, I saw on Facebook that you had bought that. Yeah, Daryl's holding up the book by Marie Howe. Marie was the New York State Poet Laureate a while back, and had her on there, and Tracy K. Smith, who was the U.S. Poet Laureate 2 years ago, and talking about poetry, and it's pretty wonderful couple of episodes with them.
Fantastic. Hey, Alan, jump in here with your question.
Thank you, Lee, for being here. I just finished reading Scandalous Witness, and appreciate the book a lot, and I appreciate your courage to write it. Where does a preacher start? I mean, I agree with what you're saying. It resonates very deeply, but you know good and well it's not going to resonate with everybody.
Yeah.
So do you have suggestions or maybe ways you have seen preachers be able to move in some kind of a direction like that?
I mean, one, I'll just say that no, I don't think that's an easy translation move at all. But I do think that we desperately have to figure out how that can happen. And if the book says anything, it says that we can't afford to act as if we can't talk about these things, because I'm making the argument there that Christianity is a politic. Not just it doesn't just have political implications, but it is itself an alternative politic, and it's neither right nor left nor religious. Not being, and by not being religious, I mean it's not this privatized spirituality thing that has nothing to do with socio-political realities. And so I think that if we don't in some way engage these things, and I think it's probably not Christianity that we're doing. But the issue of rhetoric and persuasion comes into play there. And I think that, just like in the writing of that book, I knew that that book wasn't going to be helpful. It would only be helpful to, if, for example, I wanted to come out and pick on all the things that are wrong about the right, then I knew all I'd do I'd be preaching to the choir of some people on the left. Or if I wanted to pick about everything that was wrong with people on the left, then all I would do would be preaching to the choir of some people on the right. But instead, we got to figure out a way in which we are subverting those normed expectations of people. And some of the ways that I think that kind of stuff can happen. One is just by telling stories that lead people down a path where they're with you, and then all of a sudden they get surprised about what happens at the end. And I think stories have the power to do that. So, for example, just in the podcast we released last week, I was talking about William Jennings Bryan, who's the famous fundamentalist of the Scopes monkey trial, right?
Right.
And so here you have this famous fundamentalist, one of the most conservative figures in American history, who was a major contributing factor to the culture war that we are still fighting a century later. And yet it turns out that we've all forgotten that William Jennings Bryan was one of the most liberal, socio-political liberal candidates for president ever in the history of the United States. He actually took counsel with Leo Tolstoy who was, an anarchist pacifist in trying to figure out how to do foreign policy. And here he was, three-time Democratic candidate for presidency. And so here you have this socio-political liberal who's a fundamentalist. And some of the reasons that he was so opposed to the ideology of human evolution was because he was a liberal Christian. That is, because he was a socio-political liberal who was a Christian. So he looks at the ideological teaching of the theory of evolution, and he's disgusted with German militarism and American imperialism. And he says, American imperialism and German militarism are just geopolitical manifestations of survival of the fittest. And we can't teach that stuff, or we're going to ruin our world. And he looks at laissez-faire economics, unfettered free market capitalism, and he says, look, that's all that is survival of the fittest writ in economic theory. And I didn't know that stuff until we started doing this show on that Dayton stuff, Dayton, Tennessee stuff. And so I think that telling stories like that makes people kind of sit up and say, oh, wait a second, I've never even thought about that. And so we just have to find ways to subvert people's ready at hand, presumed answers. And stories can do that a lot of times. And another thing I think I've discovered is that if I can approach people assuming goodwill and raise questions and just not be a jackass about how I raise my observations, a lot of times people will simply say, I've never thought about that way. And I need to think about that some more. And a lot of times the people are not what we suspect they are over on the other side. Last year, I had this fascinating experience a year ago about this week. I was invited to speak at a conference here in Nashville that was on a bunch of military folks. And the person who convened the gathering was a former CIA guy and a vet. And he said, I think we need to hear, he called it a CO perspective, conscientious objective perspective. We want you to come talk about being a CO. And I kept trying to get out of it because I thought that is not going to be any good whatsoever. And he asked me like 3 times. And so finally I said, okay, I'll come do what you asked me to do. And so I went in and I did my thing. And there were several people in the room I could tell were just disgusted. And this guy turned out being disgusted. He had invited me, and then he kind of threw me under the bus in front of all these people. But I was able to find, you talking about differentiation, I was able to differentiate. I was able to respond without being angry and said what I had to say. So after it was over, this guy walked up to me and he said, look, I'm a career military guy. I think he had said 20 years in the service. He said, I'm now a professor at the War College in Pennsylvania. And he said, I heard exactly what you were saying. And he said, and I think you're exactly right about the critiques that you were making. Because I wasn't trying to convince him of pacifism. I was trying to make up some critiques about militarism and so forth. And he said, I think you're exactly right. And he said, would you come to lunch with me tomorrow? And I said, well, sure, if that's what you want. And so I showed up at lunch the next day, and it was a table full of lifetime military people. One of whom was a very high-ranking officer who was he was like the head chaplain over the whole Far East theater of war. And it was amazing conversation. And what happened by the end of the conversation was I could just feel my excitement, because I realized all of these people, they think carefully about these questions, and they don't take the maddening situation of warfare in which we currently find ourselves, of endless war. They have all sorts of interest in trying to undercut that. They don't want that to be happening. And so it was this fascinating conversation where I had presumed this could be antagonistic, but instead what happened was it was this beautiful conversation of, I learned all sorts of things from them, listening to them. We had this great conversation. And it was just a good reminder of, if we can approach each other, treating them the way we want to be treated, a lot of times fascinating conversations can arise out of that. But again, it's tricky in the pulpit. And some of my most uncomfortable moments have been trying to talk about some of these things in the pulpit.
Charles Kaiser, jump in here.
You mentioned, all the crap that's going on in our country right now around the killing of George Floyd, systemic racism, white supremacy, all of that. I'm curious to hear. I totally dig the Anabaptist perspective. Have a lot of resonance with it, and I'm just curious to hear an application of your Anabaptist perspective on the times in which we live, and what's your imagination for a political response, in the way I think you would use the term, not partisan political, but alternative political kind of response that the church could offer in the day in which we live.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question as well. Well, a couple of things come to mind. At a local congregational level, this past Sunday, even, I don't know where you all are in the reopening, but currently in Nashville, in Davidson County, churches are not reopened yet. And so even though our church building is in Williamson County, we're not reopened yet either. And so after all this stuff happened, and we had riots in Nashville Saturday night, and the courthouse was set on fire, and curfew, and it was just really a mess. Started as a peaceful protest that our mayor actually was involved in, that ended at about 5, and within a couple of hours, the courthouse was on fire, and there was looting down on the main area of Broadway and so forth. And so a lot of us were kind of talking, what are we going to do with church? And so we ended up having a Zoom session. I think we had 250, 300 connections, so we probably had more people than that on the call. But and what we did was that we asked 3 of our African American members just to talk about how they were experiencing this. And we wanted a place for everybody who wanted in the church to at least be together electronically, and to hear some of our Black brothers and sisters talk about how they're experiencing it, and to say what they wanted to say. And it was not an easy conversation, and it was in some ways it was kind of raw, but it was very good. And and one of the things that was fascinating about it is that we were pushed as a church through this conversation to say, do something now, right? We've had lots of episodes where we've talked about this stuff for years, actually. But there was really a push of saying, all right, do some things now. Do some additional things, because we've done things, but it's like, do additional things. And so I don't know yet what's going to happen, and I shouldn't talk out of turn, but I know that very quickly, within 24 hours, there were already some proposals of us saying, okay, this is the time we could do X, Y, and Z. And it was very concrete stuff about how we arrange the affairs of our local community, about taking economic injustice seriously in our community, and what kind of things can we do economically, because it's a very wealthy church with a lot of very well-connected business people. And are there things and ways in which that can be leveraged in such a way to bear witness to different possibilities and put different things in place in our community? And so I just think it's going to be really interesting. I'm hopeful about that kind of piece. So there's a local congregation piece of that I think we should take very seriously as the church. Then there's the local community kind of stuff. And I tend to think on a lot of this stuff, most of us are not, I'll just speak for myself, I'm not a civil servant. And so I don't have to make a lot of these decisions. I'm reasonably well connected in the circles that I'm in. And in those circles, I think that it's important that if I get asked to show up to something that seems to make sense for me to show up at, that I show up. I got a call yesterday, for example, from our preacher. He said, look, there's several people, a number of people that I know in the Black community that have called us and said, do you want to come down and help us do some cleanup downtown from the graffiti and the damage that was done downtown on Saturday? And so I think that's an example of where if we get invited to show up to stuff like that, we need to show up to stuff like that. And then I think that whatever we can do to contribute to shared efforts in our local communities that can contribute to good constructive change, that we keep showing up for that kind of stuff and speaking up and trying to find a way to speak up. And then finally, I'll say that I think also we need to, on the one hand, one of the things that in my work, I study and read a lot in the virtue traditions. And so going back to Aristotle, as I said a minute ago, you got the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, prudence, temperance, and justice. And then Aquinas says, but you're not fully human unless you also have the theological virtues, which are a gift from God of faith, hope, and love. But one of the things that's great about the virtue traditions is they always say that that the virtues are always overlapping, and if you don't keep all of those things together, then you can corrupt the practice of the virtues. So if one has courage but one doesn't have prudence, then it's not going to really end up being courage. It could end up being foolhardiness. And if one doesn't do, and as a matter of fact, Joseph Pieper, the Catholic philosopher, he says, and he points to Aquinas and says that there actually is no virtue that's truly virtuous apart from prudence. And that's not the way sometimes our Protestant ears hear prudence. Prudence is not being compromising. Prudence is saying, what is the likely end of this? What have we learned about how to do this best? What's the way to do it in the most loving, charitable, gracious, courageous, honest, truthful way that has transparency, so forth and so on. Prudence is asking all sorts of questions about the best possible exercise of a virtue. And so simply spouting off at the mouth also is not what's needed. And sometimes it is. And so again, prudence will tell you if prudence can help us see, in this case, what I may need to do is speak up in such a way so that people are going to be ready to stone me. And that may be the case sometimes. But prudence may also tell us, okay, you've cursed the darkness enough, and now you need to light a candle in the darkness, And so I think it's always taking all these virtues seriously are a way of helping us try to sow seeds of justice and mercy and peace in the world in a way that can truly be redemptive, rather than making it about me, rather than my own virtue signaling, or rather than me trying to justify myself. It's really, how can I be of service to my local community, and how can I be of service to my local church in helping us bear witness to something different? But again, there's so many layers to that, right? Which you all know very, very well. There's so many layers to that. And it just takes time and discernment and a lot of hard work.
Really appreciate your thoughtfulness on all of these matters. Mission Alive is first and foremost a church planting organization. So we're always thinking about the church of the future. What does the community need? What kind of church is needed in the world? So let me throw that question to you. As you look at North America in the coming generation or two, what kind of church does our world need, or churches does our world need? What would you like to see out of church leaders as they try and lead into a new generation?
Yeah, one, I don't feel like I'm a good person to be stipulating what other people need to be doing, but because there's so many. I think that's one thing that's so humbling about being a Christian for as many years as I've been trying to do. By God's grace, been trying to do this now. Is that it actually turns out that there are so many wonderful servants of God in the world. and who are working with humility and patience and perseverance and trying to serve the church in beautiful, creative ways. And it's just humbling to see and watch. And that's the thing that continues to give me hope, right? Is that there's so many wonderful servants of God in the world, and who are doing such good work. So far as things that concern me, I certainly continue to be concerned, as we've already kind of indicated, of the churches given over to partisanship, or apparently in some cases being duped by the powers that be in what I take to be somewhat superficial ways. I love one of my favorite lines of Jesus is wise as serpents and harmless as doves, and we could use being a little more wise as serpents, and also being harmless as doves. We could use both of those sides of that aphorism. And wise as serpents in the sense of, oh my, we don't need to be duped by. We got to realize that there are a lot of powers in the world that will use wagging their Bible and saying some, quoting some line from Scripture, and in such a way to dupe good-hearted people, and we don't need to be duped by such idiocy. And so being able to cut through a lot of that and be wise in that way, I think is desperately needed. And then the harmless as doves piece of, really beginning to take more seriously the call of Christ to be a minister of reconciliation, a minister of suffering love, of a refusal to celebrate nationalism and militarism and all of that kind of garbage. We desperately need churches that will help us be formed in that way. And because it is one of the great idolatries of our age. And I was on a long session last night, and somebody about the recent book, and somebody raised a question about, Hitler. What about Hitler? What about Bonhoeffer and that sort of stuff? Which is a fair enough and a good enough question. But the thing I think is always so troubling to me about the what about Hitler question is that people want to ask what about Hitler so they can say, it seems like there are certain cases in which we should justify our use of violence. But the prior question to that is, what about the German church allowed them to be duped by and large by the Nazis? That's the scary question. And to realize that, the Bonhoeffers and the confessing church folks were a minority in Germany. And it was the mainstream conservative church movement in Germany that was celebrating Hitler and celebrating his love of country and celebrating his traditional values and all that kind of stuff. And, that they celebrated the fact that he was against pornography and that he was for traditional values and love of country and blood and soil and all that kind of stuff. And it just allowed so many people to be duped by that horrific force. And so I guess one of my great concerns is, how can we make sure that we are forming churches and forming people in churches who will say, not us, we have had our lesson that's less than a century old, and we're going to try to find ways not to be duped in such ways ourselves. So to me, that seemed to be one of the major needs of the church in the United States in 2020.
Great, thank you. Hey, Daryl, jump in here with your question.
Yeah, it's kind of going a little bit back to the George Floyd thing, but I think it relates to what you just said as well. I was listening to the Zoom meeting put on YouTube by the Christian Chronicle about this, and one of the speakers said, what we're facing in racism is a systemic racism, the systemic problem throughout the entire United States. And he said that he felt that the answer has to be systemic itself. There has to be a systemic answer to that. And I'd like for you to delve down into a couple of things with that in a real pragmatic sense. Answer all of my questions, okay? No, but in a real pragmatic sense, systemic and individual. what, and I'm not talking just about racism, but the rest of what we're just talking about in the militarism and all that. What can individuals do pragmatically? What can we do systemically as well? Just a few things that would be, we could put a handle on.
Yeah. Well, just thinking about systemically just a moment, there's these remarkable statistics about how the what do they call it? The school to prison pipeline, where, my understanding is that there's some predictive work done on the number of prisons needed based upon third grade reading levels. And so that's one of the things that our church has tried to do for years. Is many years ago, some very wise folks said, we need to be serious about this. Is a systemic reality, and it's important of whether or not these kids can read, and to get into neighborhoods where we can provide a service that can truly make a difference in the possibilities that someone has in their life, and to try to address this systemic reality. Another kind of systemic reality, obviously, is the economic stuff. And so, we have one of our members that was on the call on Sunday that I alluded to. He is himself an African-American banker, but part of what he does is he tries to help facilitate business development among young Black entrepreneurs, because that's another systemic reality that points to the ways in which there's a disenfranchisement, and if that's a systemic response to that reality. And so we could continue to multiply these things, but those are two examples, I think, of very practical, very pragmatic, realizable systemic responses that can be made. And continuing to get ourselves educated on the systemic realities, right? So like in the prison, the militarism stuff, if you go watch a movie like Why We Fight, documentary Why We Fight, that's one that kind of shows the so-called military industrial complex, or actually the congressional military industrial complex, and the systemic realities of all that are just mind-blowing. And so there's lots of systems and systemic realities that we need to learn about. And then we can kind of try to find ways to maybe do some alternative to some of those things. Individually, I think, it's important to just try to find ways that are true to our real life, in which we're continuing to facilitate relationships with diverse kinds of relationships. I learn things from, I continue to learn things from, one of the things we've been trying to do much more in our church context is make sure that when we're doing theological discernment, that we have the voices of women at the table. And the women friends that I have, I learn stuff from all the time, because they'll say, well, when such and so got said, have you ever thought about such and so? And I'm like, oh my goodness, no, I've never thought about that. And so the more that we can kind of do, these very close relationships where we're listening to people, that's very important. Same thing with the issues of color, race and ethnicity and so forth. So I think just the more that kind of we can do on a personal level, in our local church community, in our larger community, all of that stuff, I think is terribly important.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. We want to respect your time, so we're down to the last couple of minutes. Let me ask kind of a broad question, but thinking about up and coming, emerging leaders in the church, out of your years of ministry and your growth as a servant in the church, what one or two things would you say to emerging leaders that they need to remember as they move into church leadership?
Well, again, I don't like to be dispensing wisdom, but but I'll say that one of the things I keep pushing my students on, I'll say that, is that, and it goes back to the virtue traditions, and especially the virtue of courage. I realized after 10, 15 years of teaching ethics classes that I could teach the most brilliant ethics class. You know, they could know all the right answers, but if they didn't have any courage, that when push came to shove, it wasn't going to do them any good. And so I've started talking a lot more in my classes about cultivating courage. You know, and Aristotle says one becomes courageous by doing courageous deeds. That's the things about the cardinal virtues. So the cardinal virtues are all assumed that they come through practice and habituation. And faith, the theological virtues in the great tradition are the gifts of God that we receive and then appropriate and grow in. But the cardinal virtues are ones that we grow in by our own habituation and practice of those things. And so for courage, if I don't practice courage regularly, I am prone to be a coward. And I think that, you know, we just need to constantly be setting that in front of our young people and in front of our emerging leaders, is that you must practice courage. And so look upon conflict rather than being all threatened by it. Look upon conflict as this great opportunity to grow in courage. Look upon being criticized as a great way to grow in courage. Look upon a hard conversation because of difficult emotions that have to be faced as an opportunity to grow in courage. And so I'll tell my students, I said, you know, one of the greatest habits you can cultivate in your life is to say, I'm going to do something that makes me uncomfortable every day of my life. Just do something hard every day. It could be something physically challenging. It could be something emotionally challenging, something socially challenging, intellectually challenging, but just one thing, at least one thing every day. And it might not take 2 minutes, but the disposition of doing something hard every day, it's a meta habit that makes other things in our life possible that simply could not be possible otherwise. And so that's one of the ones I like to harp on these days.
That is a great place to end. Could not have written a better ending for our conversation. Lee, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your thoughtfulness. Thank you for the contributions that you're making to the church as a whole, through your writing, through your teaching. Your ministry is resonated well out beyond you and Lipscomb University. So we appreciate all that you do.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be with y'all. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah. And I appreciate the work that you all are doing. And it's a great gift for us to get to be called into God's service and
Amen.
Do the work we've gotten to do. So blessings on you all. Thank you.